So I just want to kind of briefly introduce the topic, and maybe because we're virtual and I'm feeling that need for human connection to do a little empathy exercise when we're talking about trade. So I'll give you kind of 4 product concepts. You can think of your own so that you can bring a human element during these discussions. We're going to have a bit of a policy discussion here. So one example would be, imagine you're the coolest kid who's learned how to code and is learning how to code with your group of friends in a small town in Nigeria or a DRC, and you and your buddies have got some laptops, you've got a solar panel, and you also want to do the right thing when these things break or need to be fixed. Or you're a young girl in India who has a sense of adventure and you want to get on the newest, coolest, fast train. You want to see the new trains, the old trains. You want to see them used as long as possible because you really just are massively in love with transportation and adventure. Or you're sitting in London and you're looking at these beautiful skyscrapers made of steel and wood and concrete, and you want to see more, bigger, cooler, new things, and you want to see old things rebuilt, the same as those trains in India. Or you're my daughter sitting in the Netherlands and you have a cute little bunny watch, and it's really cheap. It's got rubber, it's got steel, it's got a little tiny computer. And how do you compare systems on how to move the goods around with that bunny watch for my daughter, or the laptop in the DRC, or the train in India? And that's really what we face when we start thinking about trade, is we start moving raw materials and manufactured products across borders, and we run into political barriers aligned to those geographic barriers. So the framing here, I would say, is every country is an importer and an exporter of stuff. On the importing side, the concerns are generally around safety, performance of the materials, availability, and cost. And then once the things are used, we're talking about different flows. And sometimes in the trade discussions, these get all mashed up together. And those different flows are goods for refurbishing and remanufacturing, flows for secondary goods, so secondhand goods, and then flows for recycling of post-consumer materials, so you're finished with it, or recycling of waste to make those post-consumer materials or waste into secondary raw materials, and finally waste in and of itself. And what I find is in these discussions, and I'm excited about our panelists here, is we can really have a more specific discussion about these different types of materials that are moving across, and not, for example, conflate discussions about waste and certain types of toxicity with perhaps secondary goods that might be made out of very different types of materials. So, so here to talk about everything from the bunny rabbit watch to laptops and high-speed trains, we have Shunta Yamaguchi, Melina Sell, Mariana Katunen, and James Vossi, from very different backgrounds, but I think we'll have a very stimulating discussion here. I'll introduce you in turn, given the time that we're at right now, and we'll go in that order. So first, I'd like to turn to Shunta Yamaguchi from the OECD, who's a policy analyst working in the OECD's Environment Directorate on trade and environmental issues, and has had a long series of work on resource productivity and waste management, including a highly recommended report on international trade and the transition to the circular economy. So over to you, Shunta.
Thank you very much, David, for that wonderful introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to really say thank you to the organizers to make this happen remotely in these times. And so I've been asked to share our work on trade and circular economy, and I'll be using some slides. So we've been working on this topic for 2 years now, and I'll be sharing some of the insights from our modeling work in general, where we try to analyze the circular economy in general and then turn to the trade linkages. So first, we did some modeling work up to 2060 and to see how much global material use there will be under the assumption that there will be no additional policies in place from 2017 and onwards. And we see that the global material use will increase from 79 gigatons from 2011 levels to 167 gigatons in 2060. And with this increased demand in resources, there will be various environmental pressures. The most prominent one would be that the material use will be heavily associated with greenhouse gas emissions, and this will nearly double between 2011 and 2060. And for instance, 7 key materials will be associated with 9% of global GHG emissions. With concrete, that will only be, it will be associated with 12% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and over more than half of global GHG emissions can be attributed to material management activities. So we really need to see and think about the synergies between the circular economy transition and climate objectives. And then when we broaden it up to more impacts in general, including global impacts and domestic impacts on the environment, we see that primary materials causes more environmental damage than secondary materials in various aspects, such as climate change, human toxicity, land use, fresh water, ecotoxicity, and so on. So this really gives the basis why we really need to transition to a circular economy, to really reduce the environmental impacts across the life of these materials in use. When we turn to the linkages between trade and circular economy, this is the linear economy diagram that we normally turn to. And the circular economy transition is to close, extend, and narrow materials loops in various ways. The easiest to understand is closing material loops through recycling and use of secondary raw materials. You can extend the loops through eco-design policies, or also close loops through higher value loops, such as refurbishment in manufacturing, reuse, and repair. There are also opportunities for product service systems, which producers will own the product and sell the services instead of selling the product itself. And by this, the products will likely to last longer, and they're easier to collect and to treat when they reach end of life. And these initiatives largely happen within national boundaries, but there are various ways in which trade comes into play. When we look at exports, this could be trade in secondhand goods, trade in goods for refurbishment and manufacturing, trade in waste for recovery, and trade in secondary raw materials. We're showing exports here, but this can also similarly occur for imports as well. There'll be opportunities for trade in services, and also global supply chains will also be involved. So these are the trade flows, and there'll be various pressure points. The circular economy transition will have an impact on trade patterns. We need to secure policy coherence between these two areas. We need to secure the environmentally sustainability of supply chains and end-of-life value chains. We need to understand the role of international cooperation. So turning more deeply into each area, so this is on the supply chains. At the OECD, from 1990 to 2017, we've experienced a 220% GDP growth. Where we look at domestic material consumption, this remained fairly flat. So with these indicators, it seems that there is some absolutely decoupling happening between economic growth and material use. But this is when we only focus on domestic material consumption, which is looking at the direct use of raw materials. But when you look at material footprint in capita, the next bars, which looks into not only direct use of raw materials, but also materials embedded in products, intermediate goods, and final products. The amount of resources that we use in the OECD increased dramatically. This increases by 60% when we look at 2017 levels. And the very left-hand side, on the left-hand panel, you see an indication of BRICS, which is the opposite story, where raw material consumption is quite high, but when you look at material footprint, it's lower because they actually export. So these are the trade impacts, and we really need to secure the environmentally sustainability of supply chains in this transition. When we turn to end of life, this is an example given by plastic waste trade, and this is monthly data from 2016 to 2018, and we see that the landscape is changing dramatically, especially the blue shaded area is shrinking dramatically, and this is exports destined to China, which decreased by almost 99% compared to the peak in 2016. And there are two implications here. So you see that the fractions that used to be traded are not going anywhere. So we need to understand the nature, how they're actually treated domestically. Are they treated in an environmentally sound manner, or are they stockpiled, or are they heading to landfills, or maybe dumped in some cases? We need to understand the fate. And the other implication is that the fractions that used to be traded to China are in search for other outlets. There were increased pressure, for instance, in Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Thailand, and Indonesia as other outlets, but they're also considering of imposing similar import bans as China did. And so we need to understand where these fractions are headed next. When we turn, this is a diagram from our modeling work under the assumption that we do have circular economy policies and how the materials use would be reduced. And here we see that material use could be attributed to the scale effect, the dark blue bars, the gray, which is the technology or the efficiency effect, but there are also some elements that will be attributed to trade, the light shaded bars. And this is because regional production will shift and will optimize. And also there will be some substitution from primary materials to secondary materials happening in this transition through trade. So trade can contribute to reduce material use under this assumption. This is my final slide towards the mutually supportive trade and circular economy agenda. We understand that trade can create opportunities for a circular economy transition by comparative advantage and economies of scale, but these benefits should not be at the expense of environmental consequences. And this is the very important point where we really want to strike the right balance between the two. International trade flows will shift according to structural changes by the circular economy. And because there could be a substitution of primary materials to secondary materials, resource intense countries that, and also having a large extractive sector, might need to consider how they can actually align their transition. And in this sense, sustainable supply chains is key. So the inclusiveness and the just transition, as covered by the Chatham House report that was released today, will be very important, a key. Another thing is to seriously consider international standards in various aspects of the circular economy, such as material content, material quality, eco-design, recyclability, repairability, and so on. Another issue is around data availability, definition, and classification on waste and secondary materials, etc. We understand that these can be barriers to trade, and better alignment can be useful. And finally, innovation and digitalization will provide additional opportunities. So this could be through better material tracking in supply chains and end-of-life value chains. This could be through product passports or through blockchain technology and so on. So that's all from my side. You can find more information in these reports, and I'll be looking forward to the discussions.
Great, thank you, Shunta. And now to turn towards more of a national view, and you know, Melina has spoken lots on circularity and global value chains, and is now an expert on trade and the environment at Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs after quite a long stint at the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development and the World Bank. And so it'll be great to hear from you on Finland's perspective and how this kind of applies in the ODA world. Over to you, Melina.
Thanks a lot. And thank you to Chatham House for going ahead and organizing this conference despite the circumstances. I think it's sending us all a good signal and inspiring us. I will now share my screen with you. I have a little presentation here. Trying to go into full screen. I'm actually now working at the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. And just a couple of words of who we are. Sitra is a future house and think and do tank under the Finnish Parliament. We're funded by the returns on our endowment and working towards the next era of well-being, a sustainable future, both from an environmental and social point of view, really kind of bringing the Nordic welfare model into all of our thinking. And we also work on circular economy. We've been active since 2015 in this area. We created the first, or we facilitated the first national roadmap towards a circular economy in Finland. And we're also the organizers of the World Circular Economy Forum, which has brought a lot of you who are around the table or different parts of the internet right now connecting to come and debate, learn from each other, and move the discourse forward. Right now in our second phase of the program, we're focusing on just transition issues, on digitalization as an enabler of the circular economy, looking at both opportunities and challenges, at empowering businesses, and also at the global transition, which is the focus for today. So trade and development issues and also their interlinkages. And it's a pleasure for us to work, for example, with Davina and her team at the African Development Bank. So today I'll talk about why we need international trade cooperation to advance the circular economy globally and what's actually happening in this space already. So as you, David, very well pointed out, our stuff, everything in our everyday life and our consumption and production is already completely global. And that's true also for all sorts of intangible goods. So our technologies, also services, data, etc. Everything is constantly flowing around the world. And of course, in the time of COVID, there have been massive shocks to the system, and it's a time for us to kind of take a step back and reconsider which is happening. But these are very early days for that. But with the circular economy, we're looking at systems change, massive systems change, and the global multilateral system is, for that reason, so important, and finding avenues to cooperate. So also in terms of I'm getting a little message that my internet is unstable right now, so I hope you can hear me. So just as we have the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, we have our multilateral trade system, which is in crises right now. And one interesting thing to note is that as we go ahead in advancing circular economy in the trade space, I've listed here as step one is raising awareness and building a coalition of the willing. And a lot of this policy work has actually been going ahead at the World Trade Organization over quite a short period of time. So the debates and the discussion and awareness raising started at the public forum in 2018. The World Circular Economy Forums have also served to really speed up and deepen the discussion, because, and also bringing in sort of a different audience from the circular economy side, and also with participation of the expertise from OECD, WTO, World Bank, and a lot of other partners to the World Circular Economy Forum. And right now the debate is deepening and broadening at the WTO, and especially at the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. There have been very interesting contributions from least developed countries, from the EU, from China, even from the US. So it kind of gives a spark of hope for multilateral cooperation as well at the WTO, which of course is otherwise in quite a time of crises right now. And there was a lot of looking up towards the next WTO ministerial conference set to take place in June this year, and rallying around many trade and environment topics, of which circular economy was among the most popular, or most sort of contributions, most countries rallying around. Of course, right now, the ministerial is postponed until an unknown date, but for sure, this work is still continuing. So one of the topics then the topics that are being discussed here is exactly how to design trade rules and policy that can support a global transition to a circular economy. And now that we're talking about this global system, there are these certain very clear gaps and broken pieces that need to be fixed. And some of those were already discussed earlier here. And the China waste ban was kind of a shock to the system that also meant that we can't go on as before, and we need other types of systems so that we can ensure that what is traded is not going to the wrong place or not understood in the correct way. And the Basel Convention, very quickly, the countries that are party to it were able to come up with these amendments on plastic waste and allowing a new system of prior informed consent for low-grade plastic waste that wrongly had been defined as renewable raw material when it was not always the case. So just to go into a little bit of detail, despite not having that much time, some of the areas that we need to work on over the next few years, but as quickly as possible, relate to issues such as definitions. What materials are actually crossing our borders? The customs codes don't really know and understand many of the products in the circular economy. When is waste waste? When is it a secondary material? And how can we label it correctly as well? And in this context, standards and mutual recognition schemes are really important so that we can speak the same language as producers and consumers and as those trading in different directions. And so we need standards for recyclability, and there's also a strong interface with chemical health and safety legislation to ensure that the products that cross borders will be handled correctly and safely wherever they're going. Traceability is also a big issue. Already through digitalization, I think a lot of global companies are getting a much better handle on what exactly their value chains look like when they're sourcing, but we need all of that to happen in so-called reversed value chains as well. What actually happens to those products that are disposed of and that are our next sources of secondary raw materials, so that we don't end up with the situation that we have now, where partially legal or wrongly labeled products can end up in open dumps in other parts of the world. And then the other issue or some of the other issues to be further discussed and where we need solutions are unintended consequences, such as exactly what will happen to developing countries that are now natural resource exporters. What opportunities are there for them to find new niches within new, more sustainable and circular value chains? And there's also the risk of lock-in in developing countries in energy inefficient or old technologies. And of course, there's always the rebound effect. So just a couple of words on the European Circular Economy Action Plan, which Marius presented very well on earlier this morning in his speech. It's very interesting for trade from a European perspective. There is that strong focus on upstream design, so that only safe circular product will be allowed into the European market by 2030. And that, of course, is something that we need to work with our trading partners on as well, because what does it mean for them? Right to repair is one interesting element and brings up the growing role of services, and services becoming a larger and larger part of international trade. There's the issue of just transition. In the European package, the focus is more on Europe, but opportunity to be found within aid for trade and development aid. And as the Circular Economy Action Plan also creates a role for the EU in terms of global leadership, then clearly we need to align climate diplomacy, pacts on plastics and natural resources with policy. And finally, we have a set of free trade agreements. How can we use these as a lab? How can we test, for example, common standards, et cetera, within our FTAs, and then bring this knowledge also to the international and global level? So with that, I'll stop my presentation and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Melina. Sorry about missing Citra in your intro. It's the problem with reading. My eyes just went to the wrong line. Next we'll turn to Marianne from the IEEP, which I think she'll have some very timely inputs with her background on natural capital and biodiversity as well. And we're thinking about trade and stuff moving across borders and how we engage with the materials in the world, as well as non-human impacts of the lives that we lead. So with this, in the interest of time, Marianne, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chatham House, and hello to everybody around the world. So I work for the Institute for European Environmental Policy. That's what IEP stands for. And obviously, as it is in a name, our focus is on policies, and our focus is particularly on European policies and EU policy. So my intervention will be very much building on what Marius said earlier today, building on the EU's Circular Economy Action Plan, the past and the present. And also, I will be certainly building what Malena just said about trade and relevant issues. And also, I'll circle back to what other panelists earlier today have said before me. So kind of trying to look at this from the perspective of the EU and how EU can be a driver in both negative and positive way, shifting to global circular economy, and also looking at the lessons learned so far, and also how perhaps other areas in the world can learn from the lessons that EU has been learning while it's been shifting to circular economy. So the key message I will be exploring is basically this, that EU's shift to circular economy internally, policy shift to that, it will have global consequences. And importantly, those global consequences will not be positive by default. We really need to focus on making sure they will be positive. And in order to do that, there is a dedicated effort in terms of looking at our policy design in the EU. So how we design those policies for circular economy in the context of our circular economy framework. And there's also a dedicated effort needed in terms of policy coherence. So how coherent are EU's different policies? And when I say policy coherence, I mean coherence between EU's circular economy policies internally, EU's trade policy, and also EU's development cooperation policy. And that's something that EU hasn't looked at so much in detail as it perhaps should have in the previous iterations of circular economy shift, but it's now more looking into that in the future when moving on to the circular economy policy 2.0. So let's try to unpack that a bit more, looking at both the negatives and positives and also the unknowns that can be as a consequence of EU shift. So starting with the negatives, because those are the ones we've seen so far, and also those are the things that people have already mentioned in the panels earlier today. So we've seen unmanaged plastic waste shipments going in the world. We've also seen illegal e-waste shipments going in the world. And in a way, these have been, to large part, results of a policy design and policy flaw or policy loophole that has resulted in the negative consequences, triggering down true trade into the world. So for example, an element that hasn't perhaps been mentioned is that the unmanaged trade of plastic waste is partly been driven through EU's own internal policy goals in terms of recycling waste, which is great on its own, but basically because it was allowed to do also, countries are allowed to reach that policy goal by exporting trade for recycling. That sped up this now aspired issue with basically too much waste transported to countries who can't really deal with it. So in a way, internal policy failure or unknown that has resulted into something that wasn't meant to be happening in the first place. These are negatives which can be turned into positives if we really look into the policy design and look into the closing the loopholes that are in the policy at the moment. As I think we've learned also today, there is a positive impact or positive element of trading in genuinely recyclable waste or secondary raw materials, which should be and could be encouraged. But that really needs to be focused on specifically in the way that policies are being designed. And that needs to be supported by capacity building through also development cooperation support with countries and trade partner side. So that's kind of the negatives we see now, how they are caused by internal policies as well, and how they can be turned into positives by looking at impacts of internal policies, trade policy, and also the development cooperation policy as well. Then looking at the positives, and here's the one key positive here, which hopefully will happen when EU is continuing to shift to circular economy. And that's what Malena already mentioned and also Shunta mentioned earlier. So it's linked to improving standardization of standards and definitions globally for circular economy, which then allows trade and allows us to take out those opportunities globally, which can be linked to circular economy related trade. So basically, what we know at the moment is that one of the key barriers for global sustainable circular economy and trade on circular economy is not knowing what is in a product, not knowing what kind of standards the secondary raw materials have when they cross borders, and also not knowing the production standards that products have been subject to or building on in the country of the origin. And this latter is very much an issue of the renewable kind of trade and trading bioeconomy, which I'm hoping that James will pick up, in his final address of this panel. James is nodding, so that's good to know. But basically, that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about mix of different standards and which we need to hopefully then synchronize. And that's where EU plays a role, because basically when EU decides to put its own house into order, try to have standardized system that allows and supports trade within the EU, that will also be a push or incentive for trade partner countries to match those standards and try to be also standardizing in a similar level. That's the kind of idea here. So that's what we're hoping to see that will happen in the future. So EU's shift and push for circular economy, better standardization, and also more transparency in the products to be able to also help the global shift and product standards. This also will not be sustainable by default. So obviously for the trade partner countries, EU needs to support these countries to match the standards, be able to take up these opportunities. Otherwise, they will be simply left out from the loop because they can't match those standards. So that's again where internal policies, true trade, need to cooperate with our EU's development cooperation policies at the same time. So that's the positive, and I'm hoping that this will be happening in the future through the trade mechanisms as well. And finally, in terms of the unknowns, and this is kind of, you know, where Shunta was going also with his address. It will be interesting to see what will happen with the raw material trade. You know, ideally, when EU shift to circular economy, we will be seeing less trade in primary raw materials and more in terms of secondary raw materials. But you know, there are different trends that will be influencing this. But EU's internal policy by supporting the use of secondary raw materials in the products that will be entering the EU market can be a driver for a shift to using more secondary raw materials, recycled raw materials in products. And therefore it can also trickle down through the chain outside the EU more globally as well. And hopefully, of course, shifting to less primary raw material will lessen the pressures on environment globally as well, ideally. But that's what other people before me have said as well, and also what this Chatham House's report earlier mentioned today has said, is there will be issues that we need to be looking at in terms of trade partner countries whose development paths have been very much perhaps building on the trade in primary raw materials. So those trade partner countries for the EU should also look at how EU can support the shift to something else in terms of the development path in those countries if the trade shifts and not supporting the primary raw materials. My final point, as some of my previous co-panelists will be linking to the COVID and the pandemic, because we were also asked, you know, will there be impacts of this current situation on how trade will happen and what will happen with trade and opportunities. It's really difficult to see. The couple of thoughts that came to my mind in terms of negatives and positives are as follows. Obviously, if there's going to be a shift now to desperately trying to secure within EU circles of raw material as a result of you know, the trade disruptions given the pandemic, that will take the focus away from global consequences and opportunities that are linked to circular economy trade. So that would be the negative thing if that's basically what happens, that we really focus on, you know, trying to keep our loops EU level desperately because we want to be self-sufficient. But then again, I think what the current situation also shown is that there is really a need for cooperating better globally in terms of supply chains. And perhaps circular economy can be a really good excuse or good thematic element around which we can start to build on this cooperation. So kind of like a win-win in terms of trying to sort of, you know, use circular economy shift where there can be opportunities for all parties to sort of, you know, look at also sustainability chains more broadly as well. But those are my few thoughts on that. So I'll hand back over to you, David, and I think James, and then looking forward to discuss further with everybody.
Great, thanks a lot for those insights, and it's a good specific flavor looking at the EU. And James is joining us as the lead economist from and WCMC, which is a partnership between UN and the UN Environment Program and a UK-based charity. And he's currently the co-investigator leading the policy work stream of the Global Challenges Research Fund, a Trade Hub project, which is examining how trade can deliver better outcomes for people and the planet. So with that, over to you, James, and just note in the comments, I'll give some time warnings. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, so I've also got some slides, so I shall try to put those on now. and I'm going to be talking about nature and trade in the circular economy. You've already mentioned that I work for UNEP WCMC. This is a photograph of our now empty office, but we're based in the UK, in Cambridge. And as David said, we're a collaborating centre with the UN Environment Programme, and we're their biodiversity specialists. So where am I starting from with this? Nature isn't ignored in the circular economy discussions. This is a diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation flagging the importance of having regenerative natural systems, so a kind of separate cycle almost. So I have in my mind that there are almost two circles in the circular economy. So much of our discussion today has been about the traditional circular economy and the reuse of non-renewable materials, but also there's the natural cycle which underpins the bioeconomy or renewable products which are also feeding into the traditional circular economy. And I have this concern in my mind that if there is kind of non-sustainable use of nature, then the supply of sustainable renewable products into the circular economy will be diminishing, and there's the potential risk of a kind of spiraling down of the circular economy because the inputs from nature are declining. How does that relate to trade? So trade allows you to effectively separate those two cycles. So you might have a cycle of nature which is generating some products in one place, which is feeding into the circular economy in another. And if you compound that with the idea or the fact that sustainability often has a cost with it, but we don't really think about that when we are trading and perhaps just chase the most competitively priced products, you kind of have this risk of just moving around the world, picking off the lowest cost product and driving down our global capacity to produce, I suppose. I just flag up this cereal bar box because it had an interesting story which made me think about all this. And the company replaced Brazil nuts in their bars with almonds. And I thought, well, you know, that's quite an easy swap for them. But they flag up on the back of the packet that the Brazil nut harvest collapsed in Paraguay, I think it was, because of adverse climate conditions. And it had a devastating impact in Paraguay, but obviously that doesn't come through in terms of the price of the goods that we're consuming. And so I wanted to kind of flag up, and I thought that's quite a nice story that goes with it. I'm trying to rattle through this quite quickly because I realized I've got quite a lot of slides. But then I wanted to talk about, is this worth worrying about? And there's quite a few nice global reports ongoing at the moment. So I wanted to flag up some of the evidence that these really are quite big risks that we need to be thinking about in the context of the circular economy. So the diagram on the right-hand side of this slide, these are all pictures from the World Economic Forum and their recent report, Nature Risk Rising. And I think the top five of the top 10 biggest risks in terms of impact and likelihood of them happening are now viewed to be environment related. And as you can see, the biodiversity loss related risks are ever increasing, both in terms of their perceived impact and likelihood. The diagram on the left-hand side shows that these risks aren't just captured in the primary productive sectors, but they feed through the supply chains of an awful lot of other sectors as well. And this next graph shows that, again, because of the supply chain connections, those risks aren't just concentrated in the middle income, big agricultural producing countries. So that's also worth flagging up. trying to make this a little bit more real, I thought I'd show you a slide about pollinator decline, and particularly wild pollinator decline, and how that again fits into supply chains. And you can see with the infographic on the right hand side that that looks at products which are dependent on wild pollinators, so they're not easily replaced, where global production's concentrated, and where the potential yield loss is particularly high. And you can see there's some pretty important products in there. Chocolate, well, cocoa for chocolate being the key one at the center of that Venn diagram, which makes me very worried anyway. I wanted to end on a positive note though, and so this is a report that WWF brought out recently, and it looked at the costs of natural capital decline around the world, and again joined up economies through the trade system. And even within the kind of linear economy that doesn't value biodiversity, they were able to show that moving from the business as usual scenario to a scenario where we concentrate more on conserving biodiversity and ecosystem services, the benefits from nature, would generate around $500 billion a year of increased GDP, even narrowly measured GDP, which I thought was pretty surprising, but perhaps suggests how far away from the optimal amount of natural capital we've actually gone. I also wanted to flag that this is a super exciting area of work at the moment. In the UK at the moment, we have an independent report that was commissioned by the UK Ministry of Finance from a professor here in Cambridge, Professor Partha Dasgupta, and he's doing a review of the global economics of biodiversity. That is due out before the next UN Biodiversity Conference, which is meant to be in October, but I'm guessing that's probably not going to be in October, which may well mean that perhaps the Dasgupta review comes out a bit later. But the great bit about that report is it, I think, is going to be saying how modern economics doesn't really work within a bounded Earth system, and he's going to be trying to rebuild our economic machinery to show how it fits in the biosphere and how we need to reform to deliver that. And obviously there's a kind of that circle of nature regeneration story that will be heavily present within that. And then I also wanted to flag up this project, the Trade Hub, which David mentioned in my introduction. It's a big project that we're managing from UNET WCMC. It's £20 million over the next 4 years, so it's running to 2024. And we're looking at both trade in commodities and trade in wildlife across the world, and trying to understand how trade can be a tool which can deliver both more for people and better for the planet. So that will hopefully be quite useful and deliver some useful thinking in this space. One last report I should mention that I don't have a slide on, that came out earlier this week with no fanfare, because I don't think the UK government thought it was appropriate at the time, at this time even, which is called the Global Resource Initiative, and that's looking at how the UK can act through the trade system to take deforestation out of its supply chain. So similar ideas to the EU proposals, but that is now out in the public domain. And I think that's all I wanted to say. I hope I said it quickly enough.
Yeah, great. That was wonderful, James, and right on time. Good, the questions are coming in, keep them coming. But I'll turn the first question from the audience to Marianne, which is, how can the European Commission support developing countries to actually meet these trade expectations? And, you know, we know that in the Circular Economy Action Plan, leading efforts on global level is specifically called out, but with some pretty broad statements of supporting, we will enable, this type of language.
Yeah.
So many specific examples of ways that the Commission can support?
Yeah. Absolutely, and I'm really grateful for the question, because you can only cover so much ground in 10 minutes, so you can't really go into these details. So that's precisely where maybe two things come into play. So one thing that comes into play is the Aid for Trade initiative, a concrete initiative that the EU, but also other WTO countries have to support trade as a means for sustainable development. So that particular mechanism can be used and targeted to specifically support the EU trade partner countries to match the needs for elevating the standards or matching the EU standards, and kind of also being able then to continue the trade and take up these opportunities. So basically what I'm saying is there's a mechanism already in place which can be targeted towards this specific space. And my understanding actually is as well that beyond EU, but in the WTO context, it seems to be that the Aid for Trade Committee has now looked into and actually nominated circular economy as one of their key, or the key topic to be cooperating on for the upcoming couple of years. So using that mechanism to support trade partner countries, particularly in the global south, to take up these opportunities is the one thing. And otherwise, the other thing that EU can do is really, as also mentioned earlier today, focus its development cooperation aid and also that kind of support with the partner countries to support the shift in a partner country to circular economy. Because what also happens is that if a national plans for circular economy in EU trade partner country, they underpin the possibility to take up opportunities also through trade. So basically helping a country to develop its vision for circular economy and shift to circular economy on its own right also underpins taking up trade opportunities. And that's something that EU's development cooperation is well matched to do, and that's basically what it does. So helping countries to shift to circular economy on its own right also supports taking up trade opportunities. So two different ways that EU can do to take this forward.
Excellent. And so maybe a question now turning back to James. There are several questions that are a little bit related on biodiversity, trade, and pricing. So maybe to frame it a little bit, how have you seen examples where biodiversity has been incorporated into trade agreements, if at all, or how are you seeing, if you want that angle, or how can we use pricing as a way to incorporate the loss and impact on biodiversity into products, especially as we look at circular products?
Yeah, so I guess taking those two questions together reminds me of a bit of work that I have been doing at the start of this Trade Hub project. So trying to understand how you can have consistent signals across the entire supply chain, I suppose. And that can be at the level of the producer. So how do you incentivize producers to move to a more sustainable system? So that could be, how do you make sure they have access to finance if you need to invest to move from one form of agricultural production to another. That could also be delivered through looking at consumers and the signals that they're able to transfer. So if there's a preference for more sustainable production, can you manage to get that price signal all the way back through to the people who need the money? But at the same time, there are other levers that you can pull. So can you use international trade agreements? So things like banning fishing subsidies are being discussed in the WTO at the moment. And I think what we need to try and work out, and what we're doing at the start of this Trade Hub project, is thinking where all those different signals are, and what we can do to try and influence those, and also to try and prioritize those a little bit. I'm not sure that entirely answered your question, but I just wanted to flag that, yes, there are lots of points along the supply chain, and I think we need to think about all of those and maybe try and think where influence is concentrated, and can we target those kind of powerful decisions that you could change.
Yeah, I think I was trying to pull together a bunch of questions into one.
Yeah, and I tried to pull it together on an answer. It may not have worked, but I tried.
Yeah. We'll see in the comments. So thanks for that. I kind of have a broader question, and I'll address it to Shunta and then Melina in turn, which is, how does data and like what data gaps are you seeing, and what opportunities are there for applying technologies to actually enable or deliver on the trade promises that we're making?
We obviously see a lot of data gap and gaps in definition and classification in various ways. For instance, even if it's about waste, this is classified very different between countries, and also with the trade codes that Milena was talking about. And because of those differences, sometimes the waste fractions that you do not want to see go through the loops, the other way around can happen, where the fractions that can actually contribute to the circular economy can actually be prevented and be labeled as hazardous waste. So it's a very challenging area. This is also similar to, for instance, trade in goods for refurbishment and manufacturing, where a lot of industries want to recollect their end-of-life products across borders, refurbishment them and sell them again to different markets. But because of classification issues, we hear that this is not possible. So trying to investigate how we can better align the HS codes with national definitions, that's one, but that's a very long way to go, because the HS codes are only revised every 5 years, and the processes can take even longer. The prior informed consent that Milena talked about, so for the fractions that you have a prior agreement between the trading parties to allow certain fractions to go across borders, could be a way to go. But we also hear that from the industry that the process is actually quite burdensome and takes more time than anticipated. So in this aspect, I think digitalization and innovation could play a role in harmonizing the data there, also on better material tracking, product tracking, and so on. But definitely more work is needed in this area.
Milena?
Thanks. Shunta gave a very good and comprehensive answer to that. So I'll sort of jump straight to the digitalization side of the data question. And digitalization will definitely help us handle the data we have and create new data that will help us in closing circular economy cycles and gaps as well. And one example is just how we can design out inefficiencies and waste. So in many industrial processes and products that then are exported and imported, there's a big services component. And here, the sort of preemptive maintenance is very important in terms of prolonging the life of products and ensuring that that at the end of the day, also the products can be brought back as secondary raw materials. So IoT in general can help us in turning more circular. In the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, one really exciting element is the idea of digital product passports. And these would this is something that's not there yet, but that is a plan coming up, and that would really allow products to be tracked throughout their life cycle, and that would promote the kind of traceability that I was talking about earlier. So I think this is another example of digitalization and how digitalization helps. And of course, some of the new products as a service, sharing platforms, et cetera, circular economy business models are also dependent on this. So thanks.
With that, I think we need to wrap this discussion. I think you can see how broad the trade discussion can actually be, and how tricky it is. It's political. It deals with boundaries. It is complex in the types of materials and different industries we're touching upon. But I thank you all for these different perspectives, going from flows to the WTO to the EU to biodiversity and its impacts. I think we really covered some ground here today. So with that, I'll say thank you to the panelists, and I think we would applaud. So I'll give a one-person applause.